I found a Doberman, forced to pull a wagon, nonstop. And what I did next changed everything.
Pull, you lazy dog!
The
Pull!
noon heat in Hickory Bend was always harsh, but that day it felt like it wanted to peel the skin off my bones. The 106-degree F sun baked the red dirt road until the air above it shimmered like rising flames, and I sat behind the wheel of my pickup after fixing a tractor a few miles outside town, letting the cracked open windows push in a thin stream of air while the radio hummed an old country track. I only wanted to get home before the heat burned the rest of my thoughts into ash. I didn't plan to stop. I didn't plan to be a hero. I just wanted one quiet, ordinary day. Then I saw it. A bent shape hunched in the middle of that dusty road, something I first mistook for a man dragging an old wagon until the truth sharpened in the heat haze and hit me square in the chest. It wasn't a man at all, but a black and tan Doberman, so thin its bones showed through its sun-scorched coat, dragging behind it a metal wagon stacked with scrap heavy enough to be a coffin. The rope around its neck cut so deeply that the raw red grooves looked carved into living flesh. Every step made its long legs tremble like they were seconds away from folding. Its head hung low, breath cracking into short, dry gasps, and strings of drool fell onto the burning dirt like water boiling off a pan. A few yards behind it walked Earl Maddox, gaunt, sunken-eyed, pushing 70, holding the other end of the rope. He didn't say much, just one flat word, repeated over and over like a sentence passed down by someone who'd run out of humanity long ago. Move. No one stopped. No one looked for more than a second. The road lay silent, as if cruelty had become just another daily chore. I slowed, then I stopped. And right then the Doberman's legs buckled, and it collapsed sideways like a tree cut at the base. The sound was small, but it hit me like someone dropping a heart onto a cold floor. Its chest rose and fell in frantic shallow bursts, and it made no noise, no fight. Not even a plea, as if it had been taught that silence was the only way to survive. Earl didn't pause, didn't kneel, didn't check if it was even alive. He just yanked the rope and dragged that wasted body over the dirt like he was pulling an old trash bag. Something in me snapped. Not a shout, not anger, just one clear, sharp thought that left no room for retreat. Enough. I opened the door, and the heat slapped me in the face like open flame, but I walked toward them anyway without knowing what I would do, only knowing I wasn't walking away. Earl stared at me, irritated like I'd interrupted his afternoon routine. Not your business. His voice sounded like burned paper. I didn't answer. I knelt beside the dog and it opened its eyes, cloudy exhausted. But when my hand moved slowly toward it, something flickered there. Just barely. Like someone blowing life into a dying ember, I placed my hand on its head. Its skin burned hotter than sun-baked metal. "You're done," I whispered. "No more pulling." Earl shook his head. "He's mine." I stood and faced him, not anymore. Then I bent, lifted the Doberman off the ground and felt how impossibly light it was, like the heat and the labor had eaten away half its body. It didn't fight me. It didn't fear me. It just pressed its head against my chest like something too tired to worry anymore. I laid it on the passenger seat, opened a bottle of water, poured some into my palm, and held it near its mouth. No reaction at first, then a lick. Thin, weak, but alive. Earl muttered behind me about ownership law and property. I closed the door and said, "You'll never see him again." I got in, hit the gas, and the truck flung a cloud of red dust behind us, leaving Earl standing alone like a weathered stone in the Alabama heat. The Doberman lay on the seat beside me, breathing hard, broken, burned out, but alive. And this was only the beginning. If you want to know what happened when I carried that Doberman into the clinic and what the vet said that froze my blood, stay with me. The next part hurts more than you think. What would you do if you saw this in real life? Tell me in the comments and don't go anywhere because what comes next is something no one is ready for. I drove off the red dirt road, the tires grinding over the burning gravel with a sound like embers snapping underfoot, and the Doberman lay motionless on the seat beside me, with only the faint rise and fall of his chest marking each shallow, fractured breath, as if every inhale was its own battle. I glanced at him more than once, and every time I caught the thin line of his head, trembling with each broken rhythm of his lungs. I didn't know his name, I didn't know his age. I only knew one thing: he had been broken in a way no living creature should ever be broken. My name is Caleb Hart, and I've lived my whole life in Hickory Bend, Alabama, a small town so quiet that outsiders only see a few houses, a scattering of abandoned farms, and a single gas station that closes at 7. But to me it has always been home familiar, the way summer hay smells at dusk, or how crickets rattle beneath the porch every night. Hickory Bend carries a strange kind of silence. Not the gentle kind, but the kind born from people who've grown used to looking away when something isn't right. Here you can hear a tractor firing up at 5 in the morning, hear cattle calling to each other across empty fields, hear the hot wind slamming against tin roofs, yet almost never hear someone step into another person's business. Folks here learn mind your own business before they learn half their prayers. Maybe that's why no one stopped when they saw a Doberman hauling a wagon full of scrap in 106-degree heat. But I didn't. I didn't know why. I only knew that today I couldn't do what this town had done all its life: stay silent. I tightened my grip on the wheel as the truck shot past old power poles and fields burned pale by the sun stretching out to the horizon, the dust rising behind me in a long red ghost of a trail. The smell of heat, of melted plastic, of the scorched metal wagon still clung to the air like something I could taste on my tongue. I looked at the Doberman again. His ears drooped. The rope marks around his neck were carved in like burn scars. His eyes were half open but unfocused, as if the world had grown too heavy for him to care about anymore. And in that moment, something strange settled into me. I've seen dogs my whole life. Farm dogs, guard dogs, strays, wanderers, but I had never seen eyes so empty. Not afraid, not hurting, just done. I turned my gaze back to the road as we headed toward the center of town, the place where the only clinic I trusted sat waiting: Hickory Bend Animal Clinic, run by Dr. Lauren McKay. If anyone could save him, it was her. But as I drove, I realized I owed a small introduction not to you, but to this story itself. I'm not a hero. I'm not the kind of man who does good deeds every day. I'm just a guy who fixes tractors' lives alone, eats cereal for dinner because cooking feels like too much work, and has never been good with words. But some moments arrive without warning, and they ask something of you that you can't ignore. Moments that if you turn away from them, you'll carry the weight forever. The Doberman let out a soft whine, thin like wind brushing a sheet of hot metal, and I reached over to blast the AC at full speed. Cold air rushed out, and I prayed it would help even a little. "Hang in there, buddy," I whispered. I don't know why that word came out, but it sounded right. The town rose ahead of us, the peeling "Welcome to Hickory Bend" sign, the tiny store with a rusted tin roof, the breakfast diner that opened at 4:30, and beyond it the vet clinic with a faded white sign barely holding onto its letters. I pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a few seconds. I need you to understand this part. I had never felt a responsibility sit on my shoulders the way it did then. Not because I thought I was special, but because this Doberman had passed through hell and somehow I had become the last thread he had left. I looked at him again. Ranger. I tried. I don't know why that name came out. I don't know why. It fit so well. He didn't react, but I knew he heard it. I stepped out, circled the truck, and lifted him gently into my arms, his body limp and impossibly light, held up by nothing but breath. and the moment I pushed open the clinic door, letting the little bell ring overhead. I didn't know that what came next. It would hurt more than anything I had seen on that red dirt road. I pushed open the clinic door, and the familiar chime of Hickory Bend Animal Clinic rang out, but today it sounded different, as if the entire room was holding its breath for the fragile life I carried in my arms. Inside, the smell of antiseptic, the clean sting of metal, and the cold sweep of the air conditioner wrapped around us like a necessary kind of embrace. Lauren McKay, over 20 years of experience behind her, looked up from her desk with the greeting she always saved for me poised on her lips until her eyes landed on the motionless Doberman in my arms, and every part of her expression changed. She stood instantly. "Caleb, Lord, put him on the table now." I walked to the steel exam table and laid Ranger down as gently as I could, the metal so cold I could feel it shiver through his overheated body. His legs curled instinctively for a moment before dropping limp again like even his instincts were out of energy. Dr. McKay ran her hand along his neck, pausing when her fingers reached the torn ridge where the rope had chewed into his skin, and she let out a sigh, not the tired kind, but the kind reserved for pain that should never have existed. Geez. Caleb. What was he pulling? A whole wagon loaded with scrap metal. I said, my voice tightening even as I tried to stay steady. "In 106 degrees. She shook her head. Unbelievable. She checked his eyes, one clouded, the other half open and unfocused. Checked his heartbeat too fast, uneven. Checked his breathing, shallow, quivering as if every inhale cut him from the inside out. Ranger tried to open his eyes wider, scanning the room with no intent to resist, no spark of fear, only a quiet endurance that twisted something inside my chest. Dr. McKay murmured, "This kind of silence is the worst. He doesn't have enough energy left to react." I stood beside the table, my hand resting on the edge, and Ranger turned his head just slightly, the smallest movement left in him, until his eyes met mine for a single second. It felt like a blade slipping between my ribs. Those eyes were empty, but somewhere inside them was a faint streak of light, thin as a match in a cellar refusing to die entirely. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. McKay asked. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I only saw him collapse in front of me." She kept working, lifting his front leg, and I saw the pads split open, dry blood crusted in the cracks, while Alabama dirt clung thick between his nails. How long was he walking in that heat? She asked, not expecting anything close to an answer. Ranger let out a sound barely a whine, almost just a breath pushed through pain, but none of us missed it. I set my hand on his head, feeling the fever-hot fur beneath my fingers. "You're okay now," I whispered. "No one's making you pull anything again." Ranger didn't lift his head, didn't move, but something in his eyes slowed as if my voice was the first thing he'd heard in a long time that wasn't a command or a threat or the drag of a rope. Dr. McKay watched us for a moment before saying softly, "Caleb, I'm not sure he's going to make it through the night. He's right at the edge." I swallowed hard because I knew she wasn't the kind of woman to lie about survival. "I want to stay with him," I said, "no matter what." "Caleb," she hesitated. "He's not yours." I looked down at Ranger, heat rising in my throat. "From the moment I lifted him off that road," I said, slowly, "he was mine." Dr. McKay didn't argue. She studied us both, weighing something heavy inside her, then finally nodded. "All right, stay. But Caleb, if he finds his way back to the world, it'll be because of you." I pulled in a long breath, looked at Ranger, looked into those eyes carved from suffering. And I knew this wasn't just about saving a dog. This was the first moment he gave me something more important than any wound he carried, a chance for him to trust someone again. Dr. McKay motioned for me to step back as she pulled the tray of instruments beside the steel table, and Ranger lay there as still as a piece of overheated metal cooling in a dark room, his shallow, rapid breaths drawing trembling lines across his ribs. She cut away the last strands of rope still clinging to his neck with a curved pair of scissors, and when the final piece fell to the floor, the strip of raw, exposed skin underneath made me turn my face away for a second. "We have to start fluids immediately," she said, her voice firm and unshakable. "He's dehydrated enough that his blood could thicken." She slid the needle into the vein in Ranger's front leg, and he twitched barely, faintly like a body whose instincts still wanted to live, even though the mind was exhausted. I stood at the end of the table, my hand gripping the cold metal edge, afraid that if I stood too close, I'd be in her way. Yet every time I tried to take a few steps back, Ranger opened his eyes at me, just a thin slit, but as if to make sure I wasn't leaving. When the fluids began to drip, Ranger started to tremble uncontrollably. That's his body responding to the dehydration Dr. McKay explained. Could also be a sign of severe infection. She cleaned the wounds running along his back, and every time the soaked gauze touched his skin, his chest tightened and his breath came faster. I heard every shiver pass through the cold air in that room, and it hit straight into my own ribs. "I want to stay," I said quietly. Dr. McKay looked up. "Caleb, this is not easy to watch, I know, and he might not make it through the night. I'm still staying." She studied me for a long moment, weighing whatever she saw in me against the reason I had carried Ranger through her door in the first place, and then she nodded. "All right, I'll set up a cot in the back room." About 10 minutes later, Ranger was moved into the quiet room behind the clinic. Softer lights, gentler air. A place made for animals fighting for their lives. She hooked his IV to the stand, adjusted the drip, and set a heart monitor beside him. The steady beeps ticking through the dim room like a countdown. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge when Dr. McKay stepped out to prepare antibiotics. I dragged a chair close to the table. Ranger was shaking harder than before, his breath ragged like wind forcing itself through a narrow crack in the wall. I placed my hand on his chest at a spot where the wounds didn't reach. Ranger twitched, then went still. But the tremors slowed slightly, as if he'd realized that whatever was touching him wasn't violence. Not a command. Not a yank of rope or the echo of boots behind him. Just the hand of someone willing to sit beside him. "I'm here," I murmured. "You just breathe. I'll handle the rest." The room was so quiet. I could hear the low hiss of the air conditioner, and I kept talking nonsense, really about the tractor I'd fixed earlier, about the town, about how I'd once expected to live out my life alone without much bothering to change the pattern. Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his eyes slowly lost some of their emptiness. Around midnight, things got worse. He started shaking violently, breathing hard, his whole body tightening as if a wave of pain was rising from deep inside, and the monitor blared with a spike in his heartbeat. I jumped to my feet. Dr. McKay. She rushed in, checked him quickly, and gave him a small injection to bring him out of shock. I stood beside the table, unmoving, watching every second. Ranger let out a sound faint, but the clearest I had heard since meeting him, and then, slowly, his breathing eased. At 3:17 a.m., Ranger lay still again, no longer trembling. His eyes shut, his body softening as if he had finally found a place to rest. I exhaled, unsure how long I'd been holding my breath. When the first line of sunlight crept through the small window in the back room, Dr. McKay returned to check on him and whispered, almost shocked, he made it through the night. He's stable for now. I placed my hand on Ranger's head. He didn't open his eyes, but his breathing, steadier, warmer, and I knew that even though his body had been pulled back from the edge, the road to bring his spirit back would be far longer. But I knew something else too. I wasn't leaving this dog. Not now, not ever. After surviving that first night, Ranger slept longer than he had at any moment since I carried him into the clinic, and Dr. McKay said his body was patching together, whatever pieces it had left the soft yellow light of the recovery room casting over his patchy black and tan coat like a fragile warning that if I touched him too roughly, he might simply disappear. I sat beside the stainless steel bed with numb legs and a burning ache in my back. But none of it mattered. While Ranger lay still, his breathing steadier than the night before, yet still so weak that every rise of his chest made me hold my breath with him. Near midday, he shifted ever so slightly, a movement so small that if I hadn't been watching him with everything in me, I would have missed it. I leaned closer. "You hear me, buddy?" One of his eyes opened a sliver. Not fully awake, not fully aware of me, but alive with something soft and thin, but undeniably real behind it. Dr. McKay walked in just then and caught sight of it, and she smiled, a rare expression for someone with 30 years in this line of work. "That's a good sign. He's not giving up." I extended my hand slowly to avoid making him feel trapped, and when my fingers touched the top of his head, he flinched, the reflex of an animal far too accustomed to blows, and then he relaxed, just for a second, but it was enough. The next 3 days were a tangle of hope and fear, with Ranger eating barely anything and spending most of his time motionless, but every time I spoke even nonsense about the old tractor in my garage or the dusty road outside my house, his ears twitched a little as if the only working part of him was the part that still wanted to hear a human voice. On the 4th day, something small happened that squeezed my heart in the best possible way. I was sitting beside him, my head resting against the wall in exhaustion, when I heard a faint sound, the tap of a claw brushing metal, and when I opened my eyes, Ranger had lifted his head, searching for me. It took him nearly 10 seconds to hold it up, but he tried. "Hey," I said, sitting upright, "I'm right here." And he looked at me. Not the empty stare from that Alabama road. A look with a question. "Are you really here? Are you staying?" I nodded, even if he couldn't understand the gesture. "I'm here." That afternoon, I tried giving him a little water, a milestone for dogs this far gone, and Ranger stared at my hand for a long moment, wary and unsure, before he leaned forward to lick a tiny sip. Not much, but it was a beginning, and Dr. McKay watched from the doorway, nodding in approval. "Caleb, he responds to you more than to anyone. You're the bridge keeping him here." I'd never received a compliment that felt so heavy, because it wasn't praise, it was responsibility. On the 6th day, Ranger had a small relapse. Rapid breathing tremors, his eyes drifting out of focus, and I almost bolted for the door to yell for the doctor. But when I placed my hand on his back and spoke a few calming words, the shaking eased. Dr. McKay stepped in, checked him, and said, "Honestly, the way he reacts to your voice means he's learning how to trust again." Trust from a dog whose soul had been beaten numb. On the 8th day, Ranger ate 3 small bites of meat on his own, and when he lowered his head to the bowl, I sat frozen like a statue, afraid any movement would startle him. And when he swallowed the 3rd bite, I watched his tail, curled tight under his body for more than a week, twitch. A tiny movement, so tiny that anyone else would have missed it. But to me it was the first crack in the ice around his heart. That night, as I sat in the chair, Ranger slowly, carefully moved his head toward my hand and brushed against it. Not leaning, not seeking anything more. Just a touch. But that touch made my breath catch in my throat, and in that fragile, deliberate touch I knew I wasn't just saving Ranger. I was becoming his home. When Dr. McKay finally cleared Ranger to come home, I thought it would be the easiest day of this whole ordeal. Yet, the moment we stepped onto the wooden porch of my place just outside Montgomery, I realized that leaving the clinic didn't mean leaving the past. I opened the door to the spare room, bed, ready, soft rug water bowl, a quiet corner untouched by the world, and Ranger walked in on trembling legs, each step tight and deliberate like he was crossing a battlefield. His eyes flicked around the room, scanning every corner, and even the shadow of his own body on the hardwood floor made him recoil. I stood a few steps away, keeping my posture soft and my voice low. "You're okay, Ranger. This is home." But home was a luxury for a Doberman who had only known rope, shouting, and the blistered surface of a burning road. The afternoon crawled by with the pace of 2 breaths too far apart, and Ranger stayed frozen in a corner for nearly 2 hours before he dared to lie down yet when I stepped into the kitchen for water. The soft click of a cabinet, nothing more than wood tapping wood, sent him bolting under the table in a panic. No whining, no barking, just shaking and gasping, his eyes stretched wide as if dragged backward into a place I couldn't see. I sat on the floor beside the table, not reaching, not touching, just being there. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3. By the time night settled in, Ranger still hadn't moved, and I whispered, "You don't have to pull anything anymore. No one touches you. We just exist next to each other." Near midnight, Ranger finally peeked out, slow, wary, but searching, and he looked at me. Really looked. And he stepped out. Late. Very late. But he stepped. The next 3 days passed more gently, with Ranger wandering the room, sniffing the furniture, even sleeping several hours without jolting awake, and I thought we were climbing out of the valley. Then came the 4th evening. A sudden Alabama thunderstorm cracked open, outside rain slamming the tin roof while thunder rattled the window panes, and at the first boom, Ranger froze. His ears pricked his body, arched as if bracing for a blow. I couldn't stop. Then he ran. Not away from me, but toward a place where he believed he needed to endure it. He barreled into the laundry room, the tightest corner of the house, and wedged himself between the dryer and the wall, shrinking down as if he could disappear into the tile. My chest cinched. Not because he feared thunder, but because of how he feared it, like he had once been punished simply for existing. I sat on the cold tile a few feet away, and he didn't look at me. He just trembled. "Ranger," I whispered. "I'm here. There's no one else. Just me." Thunder cracked again, and Ranger shuddered harder, gasping for air, and I knew if I did nothing this night would drag him right back to the beginning. Then I remembered the one thing Ranger had held on to, the worn piece of rope I'd found when I saved him, the same rope that had dug into his neck as he pulled the wagon, and I'd kept it not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that the past no longer owned him. I got up, retrieved the rope, and brought it into the laundry room. "I want you to choose again," I said, placing it gently on the floor a small distance from him. "Choose what belongs to you. But this time, no one's making you carry it." Beside it, I set a soft towel, the one I'd used that first night in the clinic to wipe his back, the only thing with my scent he'd ever accepted. 2 choices: old hurt, or a new safe place. Ranger looked at both. A long time. Rain still falling, thunder still shaking the windows, and he trembled, but his eyes no longer held panic, only a fight deep inside. Then he moved, not toward the rope. He inched toward the towel. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath, and Ranger lowered his head gently, touching his nose to the towel, a small gesture that felt like a declaration: I want to live. I want to trust. I want to stay. I placed my hand on the floor, not approaching, just offering, and Ranger shifted closer, then rested his head lightly on my fingers. Thunder cracked again, but this time he didn't run. That night in that small laundry room with the rain hammering down across Alabama, Ranger did the one thing I had hoped for since the day I found him on a red dirt road. He chose me, and I knew from that moment on, neither of our lives would ever be the same. Summer in Alabama passed slowly, in the way Southern life always does, unhurried, unbothered, and within that slow rhythm, Ranger grew day by day, week by week, with small changes, only someone who has cared for a broken life could ever notice. The days after that storm were still cautious ones for him, with Ranger keeping a careful distance and scanning every sound before taking a step. Yet the blind panic in his eyes had faded, replaced by a thin, fragile light, like the first beam slipping through an old window. Every morning when I brewed coffee, Ranger would tiptoe out of the spare room and stand at the threshold as if asking for permission. I always said, "Come on in, buddy. This is your home too." And slowly, with the caution of a soul unfamiliar with freedom, he walked toward me. Slow, but willing. On the 16th day since I brought him home, Ranger rested his head on my leg for the first time as I sat on the sofa, placing it there without warning, without asking for anything more than a place to lean. I didn't speak, I just set my hand on his head, understanding that the most meaningful things never need words. A month passed before Ranger learned to step onto the porch, standing at the doorway at first as if the outside world were a trap, waiting to swallow him, and each time he backed away I sat beside him, to show I wasn't going anywhere. Then one afternoon, with soft sun and pine needles falling gold across the yard, Ranger walked out. Not hesitant, not searching for escape routes, and took a few steps onto the dirt, breathing in the air before turning to look at me. For the first time, that look wasn't a question. It was an invitation. "I'm here. Come with me." I stepped down beside him, and Ranger lifted his head, his ears tipping forward, the breeze brushing through his black and tan coat until it shimmered in the light, and nothing about him resembled the dog who collapsed on that red dirt road. He looked like a life being reborn. When Ranger was strong enough, I decided to take him back to where we'd first met, the blistered stretch of road running through Montgomery, because I wanted him to see that the past no longer held him, that he was stronger than anything that had happened to him. Ranger stood on that road, nose lowering to the dirt, and he didn't tremble, didn't fear, didn't search for a place to hide. He simply looked around, then walked back to me, pressed his nose into my hand, and chose to stand at my side. A small ritual, but sacred. His way of saying, "I don't belong to this place anymore. I belong to you." I knelt and wrapped my arms around his neck. "We did it, buddy." The evening breeze swept through, softening the Alabama heat, and the road that once looked like hell now felt like the beginning of a wordless friendship. Now, every night, Ranger sleeps at my feet on the living room rug, breathing slow and deep with a peace I never knew he could have, free of tremors, free of frantic eyes searching for danger, simply living the life he should have had all along. And I realized I'd changed too. Since the day I found Ranger, the emptiness of living alone no longer echoed the way it once did, and a life that seemed forgotten found a way to pull me back to myself. Maybe saving a dog doesn't change the world, but it changed mine. And maybe that's enough.